I did so adamantly and repeatedly. On the night of his trial, I stood by a fire within earshot of him and emphatically claimed I knew nothing about him. Then the next morning, I witnessed his crucifixion. It wasn't anything like I expected. Nothing with Jesus ever is. Roman crucifixions are always the same. Prolonged, ultimate agony, followed by pitiful defeat and death. But that was not the story of Jesus' crucifixion. The way he suffered was so utterly unexpected. He prayed for forgiveness for his crucifiers. He promised imminent paradise to the criminal hanging next to him. And his death cry was no suffering wail of despair. It was a confident shout of victory. That was Friday. Then came Resurrection Sunday. I witnessed him alive again. He had conquered the grave, but I had been conquered by fear. He had completed his mission, but I had denied the Messiah. When I saw him resurrected, grief turned into joy. Defeat became conquest. But then I remembered that I had denied him repeatedly. His truth would continue to be proclaimed, but not through me. I had given away the greatest privilege of my life, to be one of his chosen witnesses. My worship of him would endure, but my work was forfeit. Then came the second greatest moment of my life. The first was Jesus' resurrection. The second was my restoration. Jesus appeared to me on the shoreline while I was fishing, and he had a fire going, which reminded me of when I had denied him. But by this fire, Jesus restored me. He called me back into his service. I was washed up, but Jesus made me his witness once again.
Thank you, Peter. Would you please get your Bibles out? Open up to Luke chapter 22. If you don't have a Bible, put your hand up and we'll bring one right to you at your chair. Luke chapter 22. Every life is shaped by defining moments. Those moments become life-changing events. And those life-shaping... Did we get a Bible up here in the front? I think there's another Bible needed right up here. Those life-shaping moments, they strike our lives like a gale-forced wind at times, bending us to their will. They forever leave their mark upon our lives. Tonight, what we're going to do is we're going to look at 4 defining moments in the life of Peter, the witness that we heard from a moment ago. And as we do that, here's what I'm asking you to do. Be sure that you do some personal evaluation. And here's why I say that. What you will find in your life as you follow Peter is you'll find that your footprints are alongside of his on the journey. The path that we take tonight will at times be a little painful. However, here's what eventually is going to happen. We're going to emerge with Peter out of that valley, and we're going to stand on the mountaintop of power and restoration. Scarred, but strengthened. forever marked by failure, yet rejoicing in this, rejoicing that Jesus was able to take the ashes of our failure and use them as mortar to anchor us to his will. So let's take a journey with Peter down into his valley until his darkness envelops us. Let us face his failures, and as we do so, face our own, and spend a moment grieving with him over his sin and over our own sin. But we're not going to remain there for long, because we're going to be visited down in that valley by one that takes valleys and shapes them into mountaintops. One who dispels darkness with his brilliant light. Tonight, Peter's story is going to show us that sin, no sin, is too black, and no past is too broken for Jesus. Luke chapter 22. But as we begin, let me just tell you an affinity that I have with Peter. A literal affinity with his life. Here's that affinity. It's about fire. Fire. I like fire. I mean, I really like fire, big fires. I like fires when it's cold outside. I like fires when it's hot outside. Fire is entrancing to behold. It's an ever-changing, never-repeating creative dance, like of light and color and smoke and spark. It is at once both comforting and dangerous. I like that. In fact, fire is my favorite cologne. Now, let me rephrase that. I'm going to back up from that statement a little bit. Fire is the only cologne that I will wear when I get a chance to around a campfire or around a hunting fire. I love the smell of fire, and I like it to linger in my clothes. I love fire. So how does my fixation with flames relate to Peter's life? Here's how. All four of the life-defining moments that we're going to look at in Peter's life, each one takes place around a fire. It was by the fire that Peter was broken, and then it was by a fire that Peter was restored, and it was by a fire that Peter was transformed and empowered. And it will be by a fire that Peter is rewarded. So let's go to fire number one. I'm going to call this the fire of brokenness. And by that fire of brokenness, Peter denied that he even knew Jesus. But before we go to that fire, I think there's something important that we need to do. We need to look, as we watch Peter, as we follow him, we need to look at the steps that Peter took that led him to the fire of brokenness. And we need to do that because they're the steps that lead us there. A few hours before Jesus' crucifixion, he had a final meal with his disciples. And during that meal, he said to them, "Every one of you is going to desert me." Peter didn't like that comment. I want you to see how Peter responded when Jesus said that. Look at Luke 22, 33 and 34. Peter said to him, Lord, I am ready to go with you both to prison and to death. Jesus said, I tell you, Peter, the rooster will not crow this day until you deny 3 times that you know me. Peter boldly claimed that even death itself, the threat of death, could not cause him to deny Jesus. So there's a question. Do you think Peter was sincere that night when he made that bold claim? I absolutely believe Peter was sincere. So what would take him from bold allegiance to sin's brokenness? Well, here's the answer. It's the same thing that takes you and I there. The same steps. Here's step number 1, arrogance. Do you remember the reply that Peter made to Jesus? Do you see the arrogance in that statement that Peter made? Peter did not understand his own depravity. He had failed to recognize his absolute dependency upon God. And that arrogance eventually led him to brokenness. And you and I, like Peter, we need more than association with Jesus to win the victory over temptation. We need humility. We need a keen awareness of our weakness. We need an understanding of our total dependency upon God. Because once you take that first step of arrogance, just like Peter, it inevitably leads you to the second step that Peter took. You see, later that same night, Jesus took his followers to a garden to pray. And when he got to the garden, he told them to wait for him there as he went deeper into the garden so that he could have some solitude in prayer. And when he finished praying and came back to his disciples, let's listen and look at what happened. Luke 22:45-46. And when he rose from prayer, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping for sorrow and said to them, "Why are you sleeping? Rise and pray that you may not enter into temptation." You see, Peter's second step toward brokenness was complacency. Peter's arrogance prompted him to be lazy. Instead of being vigilant, he became spiritually complacent. And that is a principle that impacts every one of us as followers of Christ. If we take that first step toward arrogance, toward believing that we are above failing, above denying by our sin Jesus, that leads us into a place of complacency. And just think about what Jesus did. Jesus even had warned Peter that night. He said, "Peter, tonight you're going to be tempted." He even told Peter what he needed to do to guard himself against that temptation. He needed to watch and to pray. But Peter didn't heed the advice of Jesus. Peter's arrogance caused him to settle into complacency and drift off to sleep. And then the soldiers came to the garden, and they arrested Jesus, and in fear, all of his disciples deserted him. And Jesus was taken to the home of Caiaphas, the Jewish high priest, where he was interrogated. Look at Luke 22:54-55. Then they seized him and led him away, bringing him into the high priest's house. And Peter was following at a distance. And when they had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and sat down together, Peter sat down among them. Did you see it? Did you see the picture of Peter that is painted here in this verse? Let me read it for you again. Peter was following at a distance. The poster child of boldness is now following at a safe distance, staying in the shadows. He wanted to be close enough to know what was happening, but far enough away to protect his own interests. And Peter's third and final step toward brokenness was the step of compromise. Look closely at his tracks. Ask yourself, am I walking those same tracks? Is your life characterized by a little Jesus and a little compromise? Do you want to be close for the benefits but far enough away so that it doesn't cost much? Those three steps of arrogance, and then complacency, and then compromise led Peter to the first fire, the fire of brokenness. It was a cold night. The soldiers in the courtyard there of Caiaphas' home, they built a fire to warm themselves as Jesus was being interrogated. Then Peter stepped out of the shadows and he came up to the fire. Stepped out of the shadows of compromise up to the fire. Next to that fire, Peter was broken. 3 times, someone recognized him as an associate of Jesus and called him on it. And 3 times Peter denied it. And with each successive denial, he got louder and he got bolder. And in his attempt to be convincing, in his third denial, he called curses down upon himself, swearing that he did not even know that man, Jesus. And then comes the great moment of brokenness. Look at verses 60 and 62. Peter said, "Man, I do not know what you are talking about." And immediately, while he was still speaking, the rooster crowed, and the Lord turned and looked at Peter. And Peter remembered the saying of the Lord, how he had said to him, "Before the rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times." And he went out and wept bitterly. The fire of brokenness. What a long journey Peter took in a few short hours from sincere, wholehearted allegiance to profane denial. Through the steps of arrogance, complacency, and compromise. And Peter's first fire is an open book for us. often, and I put myself right in this camp as well, every bit as guilty at times as Peter, overestimating our own spirituality, underestimating our daily dependency upon Jesus. We, like Peter, if we're not careful, we can try to follow Jesus at a distance, wanting association with Jesus without the cost of discipleship, wanting the Savior, but not the suffering. And here's the problem with that. Christianity comes with a cross every single time. Peter's life for a short while was defined by that first fire, ravaged by that first fire. Jesus was crucified following day. And then just as he said that he would, he rose to life, walked out of the tomb, and appeared to Peter. Yet even after Jesus appeared to Peter, he is still a broken man. And it's not hard to understand that Peter would have considered himself disqualified as an apostle after the events that had taken place, no longer usable to the master as depicted in the monologue. But what I want you to do is I want you to turn to John chapter 21, and we're going to make our way to the second fire of Peter's life. John chapter 21. John 21, verse 3. Here's what Peter does. He doesn't know what else to do. He's a man no longer with a mission. He decides to go back to his fishing, from which Jesus had called him. Chapter 21, verse 3. Simon Peter said to them, this is the other apostles, I am going fishing. They said to him, we will go with you. They went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. See what Peter's doing here? He's going back to the boat, back to what Jesus had called him out from. When Jesus had called him out of the boat to become a fisher of men, but that's forfeit now. And back to the boat he goes. You see, in the aftermath of his brokenness, Peter had a keen sense of his own unworthiness. He had run from Jesus in the darkest moment. He had exchanged his vow of loyalty for a curse of denial. And so what he did is he laid aside the high calling that Jesus had given to him, and he picked up the fishing nets once again. But listen and look at Peter's story and listen for your own story. Jesus was not through with Peter. Yes, Peter had denied him. But here's the real question. Would Jesus deny Peter? A week or so later, Peter got a powerful answer to that question. John chapter 21, verses 4 to 6. Just as day was breaking, Jesus stood on the shore, yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to them, children, do you have any fish? They answered, no. He said to them, cast your net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some. Sound familiar? So they cast it, and now they were not able to haul it in because of the quantity of fish. And when they looked at their bulging nets, John looked at Peter and he said, "Peter, it is the Lord." And Peter, quick to act, Peter went right over the side of the boat. And when Peter got to shore, here's what he found. He found the second fire that became a defining moment in his life. Verse 9, when they got out on land, they saw a charcoal fire in place with fish laid out on it and bread. This was a fire built by Jesus. It was a fire of grace, a fire around which Jesus is going to restore Peter into his service. And what I want to do is I want to show you how hot the fire of grace burns. First, look at verse 5 again. What did Jesus say when he called out to them from the shoreline? What did he call them? He called them children. He didn't say deserters. He didn't say deniers. He said children. Secondly, Peter had denied Jesus 3 times. And around the fire of grace, Jesus dealt with those 3 denials. Look at verses 15 to 17. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." He said to him, "Feed my lambs." He said to him a second time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." He said to him, "Tend my sheep." He said to him the third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep." Jesus asked Peter 3 times, "Do you love me?" Jesus is not heaping guilt upon Peter. Don't read it like that. Jesus is working to restore Peter, not reject him. 3 times Peter had driven a spike of denial deep. And 3 times Jesus gave Peter the opportunity to affirm his love for Jesus. And did you notice the way that Jesus asked that first question the first time in verse 15? Let me read it for you again. "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" And I want to show you what happened to Peter in his brokenness. One of the things that broke in him was his arrogance. Because Peter does not say, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you more than these." He doesn't say that. He just says, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Had he said that, it would have been an arrogant statement. But there is no arrogance in his statement. There is only a sincere communication of his love for Jesus. Not saying, like he had said earlier, "If everyone else falls away, not me." Not saying here, "I love you more than any of these." He is just saying, "Jesus, I love you. You know that I love you." And then thirdly, look at how hot the fire of grace burns here. Jesus not only restored Peter, reaffirmed Peter and his call upon him, he called Peter to a position of leadership. He said, "Feed my lambs," verse 15. "Tend my sheep," verse 16. "Feed my lambs," verse 17. What's the truth here? The truth is that the fire of grace that Jesus builds burns hotter than any fire of brokenness that you and I or Peter has warmed ourselves besides. The fire of grace says Jesus has not washed his hands of you. Jesus is not finished with you. Though your sin may be great, though it may shock you how far you fell, Jesus is greater still. His grace conquers all. And where sin abounds, grace superabounds. At the first fire, Peter was broken. At the second fire, Peter was restored. But there is a third defining fire in Peter's life. And the third fire is the fire at which Peter was set ablaze in power. Turn to Acts chapter 2. Acts chapter 2. Acts 2, 1-4. This is 40 days after the resurrection of Jesus. Acts 2, 1-4. When the day of Pentecost arrived, they were all together in one place, and suddenly there came from heaven a sound like a mighty rushing wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting, and divided tongues as of fire appeared to them and rested on each one of them. And they were all filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit gave them utterance. Here, this third fire is the fire of power. And I want you to see what happened in Peter's life when his life was ignited by this third fire. Here's what he did. He threw out a spiritual net, not a physical net. He threw out a spiritual net for souls when he preached his first sermon. And guess what he caught? He caught 3,000 men for Jesus in his first sermon. Does that sound like he's restored? Does that sound like he is now reinstated and empowered by Jesus, still accepted, still having a call upon its life? It does to me. And that fire never died in Peter's life. Never. Never did he deny Jesus again. And he had much more significant, threatening moments than he had at that fire in Caiaphas' courtyard. And yet he never denied Jesus again. And at the end of his life, Peter faced denial or death. And guess what he chose? He chose death. Willingly embraced death for Jesus. Transformed by the fire of power, the third fire in his life. See, Jesus, when we, by our steps of arrogance and complacency and compromise wind up at the fire of brokenness. Jesus does not just take us to the fire of grace to forgive us. He takes us to a fire of power to equip and enable us to be used by Him. I told you there were 4 defining moments around 4 fires in Peter's life. We've looked at 3. Let me show you the last one. And we have those separated 2,000 years from Peter in history. We have tracked with him. We have walked with him, watching his footsteps, seeing our own. But the 4th fire that's coming for Peter is the same fire coming for us. We're going to join him there. We're literally going to be there at the 4th fire with Peter. Let me show it to you. 1 Corinthians 3, 10 to 15. 1 Corinthians 3, 10 to 15. This is Paul writing to the believers at Corinth. And he's writing to them about the gospel of Jesus, the foundation, he calls it, that he's proclaimed to them and that they have accepted. And he's telling them here about the very end of their days, the end day, the final day when their life will be judged by fire. I'm calling it the fire of revelation and reward, and we are going to stand at that fire along with Peter. Let me read, follow as I do, verses 10 to 15. According to the grace of God given to me, like a skilled master builder, I laid a foundation, and someone else is building upon it. Let each one take care how he builds upon it, for no one can lay a foundation other than that which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. Now, if anyone builds on the foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw, each one's work will become manifest, for the day will disclose it, because it will be revealed by fire. And the fire will test what sort of work each one has done. If the work that anyone has done on the foundation survives, he will receive a reward. If anyone's work is burned up, he will suffer loss, though he himself will be saved, but only as through fire. So here's the illustration, the vivid picture that Paul paints. He's talking to believers who have built their life upon the foundation of Jesus, a foundation that Paul had laid as he proclaimed the gospel to them. And everyone whose life was anchored on that foundation through trust in Jesus was saved, eternally saved. But there's a day coming when their life would be judged, tested by fire. And the fire would bring to light, it would expose, it would disclose something. And what will it disclose? He paints the picture of things that are consumed in the fire and things that are not. The things that are consumed in the fire are these things: wood, hay, and straw. But then there's also gold, silver, and precious stones that the fire does not consume. And so the picture is this: our life is going to be tested by fire, the life of believers. And if what we have built upon with our life That means having been saved, what have we given our life to? Have we given our life to temporal, worldly things, fleeting things, things that are going to burn up in the fire, that are going to be consumed on the last day? Or are we living our life for eternal realities? Are we using the opportunities that we have both to grow in our knowledge of God and help others come to know Him? Those are eternal things. And when our life is tested by fire, it will be revealed whether we have given our life to things that are insignificant and temporary or things that are eternal and lasting. And our reward will be based upon that. All anchored in Jesus will be saved, but not all will receive the same reward. And the fire will test the life and determine if you've given yourself to eternal things. Do that. Do that. Do that. You will not regret any moment of this life spent on that final day giving yourself to eternal things, growing in your knowledge of God, helping others come to know and grow in their knowledge of God through the person of Jesus. Be ready for that fire. It'll be a defining moment for Peter and for every follower of Jesus, a moment that shapes the rest of our eternity. So give yourself to building upon the foundation of Jesus eternal things that'll stand the test of that fire.